reality, captured in user-friendly symbols and processed for understanding. The Idea Channel.
I present Professor Friedman. My topic today, as you know, is who protects the consumer. In recent years, consumer advocacy has been something of a real growth industry. It's been sparked in this country, of course, by Ralph Nader, who played the same role in developing the consumer advocacy industry that Henry Ford played at a much earlier date, and with much greater benefit to consumer, I may say, in developing the automobile industry. But since Ralph Nader has developed into a multinational conglomerate, he has had many imitators and many successors, and there has been a whole host of organizations and agencies that have developed, supposedly to represent the consumer. These organizations, this whole movement, has had three common characteristics. In the first place, it has been very strongly anti-business. It has portrayed to the public the notion of business enterprises as heartless giants who will go to any lengths to force down the throat or into the hands of the unwilling consumer shoddy products which will break under their hands. Of course, Ralph never tells the contrast between the character of the products that are distributed and the method of distributing them, namely the post office. But in any event, the thrust of the argument is anti-business. A second common characteristic is that it's also highly critical of past government measures. Ralph Nader and his associates have been extraordinarily effective in demonstrating the extent to which past attempts at governmental regulation of industry, past attempts at government protection of the consumer, have been ineffective or counterproductive, the extent to which they have backfired. Some of his studies on the ICC and on other agencies, which I'll come back to in a little bit, have been extremely effective. But in the third place, if you ask what is your answer, what is it that these consumer advocate agencies propose? It always turns out to be more of the same. They always propose that because past regulatory measures have been ineffective or counterproductive, the way to improve matters is to have further regulatory measures by government. Of course, this time they're going to be in charge, and so this time it'll be good people who will undoubtedly, in their opinion, do good things. I should say that this viewpoint, this contrast between their attitude toward past government measures and their attitude toward future government measures is characteristic not merely of the consumer advocates, but of the whole class of people who are termed in these days modern liberals. There are few people who are more effective and more damning in their criticism of past government measures. You ask any modern liberal what he thinks about past welfare programs. Ask him what he thinks about those past governmental programs to improve the inner city of New York, to rescue the poor people in New York from their situation. Ask him what he thinks about past government control of railroads or of anything you want. Indeed, I have increasingly come to the conclusion that the best way to define a modern liberal is as someone who thinks that all past laws are bad and all future laws will be good. Because when it comes down to what they propose to remedy these evils, it always turns out to be the same kind of things that have failed in the past. The movement, the so-called consumer advocacy movement, in its own terms, has been enormously successful. there's been a meteoric rise in the number of governmental regulatory agencies ostensibly designed to protect the consumer. The old agencies, and here I have to refer to my notes because otherwise I wouldn't remember all of them, the ICC, FDA, SEC, CAB, FCC, FTC, FPC, have been supplemented by a host of new ones. The NHTSA, the OSHA, the OPA, the EEOC, the CPSC, the CFTC, the NTSB, and so on. Note that one of the effects of the increasing crowding of the spectrum has been they've had to go from 3 alphabetical letters to 4. I challenge you indeed. It's an interesting contest. We could have a kind of a classroom contest to see if you could translate those esoteric initials I gave you into the names of the agencies, all of which I may say are out there to protect you, supposedly. In 1975, there were at least 27 major federal government regulatory agencies. They issued 60,000 pages of rules. 60,000 pages of rules or proposed rules in the Federal Register. Their regulations occupied no less than 72,200 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. I went to my bookshelf and measured what that would mean, and it turned out that turns out not to be a 5-foot shelf of great books, but a literal 24-foot shelf of not-so-great books. The expenditures of these agencies on your behalf have literally tripled in the 5 years from 1970 to 75. That's the latest year for which I have figures. They've gone from $1.6 billion in 1970 to $4.7 billion in 1975, and unless I am greatly mistaken, we ain't seen nothing yet. Those are only the direct expenditures. Those are what the government spends through the budget. They do not include the costs which those agencies have imposed on the rest of us in the form of the standards mandated on us. If you take, as the simplest example that is most familiar to all of us, the so-called anti-pollution and safety requirements on automobiles. If those amount to about $500 to $1,000 worth on any automobile, if the government imposed a tax on each automobile of $500 and used the proceeds to pay directly for those items, that would appear in the federal budget. But there is no economic difference whatsoever between the present situation in which you and I pay for them directly, but are forced to pay for them whether we want them or not, and the situation in which we pay taxes and the government spends it. So those figures are a gross underestimate. Well, we've had this enormous growth, and we're continuing to have in these agencies, in expenditures, in rules, in regulations. Is a consumer better protected as a result? Can he now settle back and say, well, now I'm all taken care of, I can forget about that? My thesis, and what I'm going to try to persuade you of today, is that the answer is a resounding no. That on the contrary, these agencies, these regulations, these bureaucrats have not only picked our pocket, but they have left us less well protected than we were before. When we as consumers really need help, we'll find the self-styled consumer advocates conspicuous by their absence. Now let me emphasize that I'm not questioning the motives of the people involved. You know, there's an old saying that you all know about what it is that the road to hell is paved with. Intentions are one thing, it's results we want to look at. But let me give you an even better quote. And this is one from Justice Brandeis, going back to the year, I think it's 1928 or 29, in one of the Supreme Court cases. And I quote, "Experience should teach us to be most on our guard to protect liberty when the government's purposes are beneficial. Men born to freedom are naturally alert to repel invasion of their liberty by evil-minded rulers. The greater dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning but without understanding. To illustrate my thesis, before I discuss it at greater length, let me just note 3 recent governmental activities which are clearly anti-consumer. And yet ask, where have our so-called consumer advocates been in respect of them? The 3 I take as illustrations, and I could take a great many others, are first of all, the recent so-called voluntary agreements negotiated by the U.S. government with Japan to limit the export to the United States of color television sets, and with Hong Kong and Taiwan to limit the export to the United States of shoes for sale here. A second example is the proposal that is under consideration and that has been made by the administration to require that a minimum fraction of oil imported into the United States from abroad be carried in so-called American flag ships, U.S. flag ships. And a third proposal, which perhaps strikes closer to home to the people in this particular audience, is a proposal to ban the actual action some years ago in banning cyclamates and the recent proposal to ban saccharin. Now there's nobody, literally no one, who would deny that the first 2 of those measures, the so-called voluntary import quotas and the oil requirements, there's no one who would deny that that's anti-consumer. The effect of restricting imports of color TV sets will be to make the prices of color TV sets higher and the quality lower. There is no conceivable way in which that can do the consumer any good. The effect of restricting the imports of shoes is to give you a smaller range of choice and to raise the price of shoes. The effect of requiring the oil to be carried in ships is going to raise the cost of domestic oil by sums that have been variously estimated from $200 million to $500 million a year. Who's going to pay for that? The Arab sheiks aren't going to pay for it. The tooth fairy isn't going to pay for it. You and I are going to pay for it as consumers. It doesn't matter whether we pay for it directly in the price of gasoline at the pump or whether we pay for it indirectly in taxes which are used to subsidize the American merchant marine. Either case, we're going to pay for it. So I say there is nobody who would deny that those 2 measures are anti-consumer. And yet I ask you, have you heard Ralph Nader on the subject? I haven't either. I've been listening. I've been waiting. Have you heard any other consumer advocate on the subject? Have you heard the people who have been proposing a consumer protection agency in Washington on the subject? They've all been conspicuous by their absence. Now the third item, the banning of cyclamates and the proposed ban on saccharin, some of these people would claim it's pro-consumer. But then if you ask them, whom are you protecting the consumer against, the answer is clear. Himself. They believe pro-consumer, by which they mean that they are forcing you to do what you would do on your own free will if you were as sensible and as smart as they are. After all, the argument about saccharin and cyclamate is that it carries a risk of producing cancer. I have no competence whatsoever to question the scientific evidence on that. I wouldn't try to. But obviously, the right way to handle it from a point of view of a believer in freedom is to let people know and then let them make their own choice. No objection to publishing this information, making it available, letting you know what the risks are, saying they're 1 in 10 million or 1 in 1,000, whatever may be the best evidence. Have a free press. But then the question is, ought you not to be able to make your own choice? And let me point out to you how utterly inconsistent and contradictory are the people involved in this. I'm going to come back to the FDA later because it's such a fascinating agency in general, and for this group in particular. But let me point out how contradictory the whole attitude is. There is nobody who would deny, there is not a person at the FDA, there is not a person in one of these consumer agencies who would deny for a moment that the smoking of cigarettes is a far greater source of death from cancer and from other diseases than even the most extreme figures you could put on cyclamates and saccharin. If it is right, if it is correct, if it is proper public policy to protect the consumer against himself with respect to saccharin or with respect to cyclamates, the same logic says it is proper policy to prohibit the smoking of cigarettes. I refer to cigarettes, but of course you realize that the same thing is true of booze. Again, the evidence linking consumption of alcohol to human death, both directly through the effect on human health and indirectly through the effect on accidents on the highways, are far greater than any conceivable effect from saccharin or from cyclamates. Indeed, there's no doubt whatsoever that if you could effectively prohibit drinking, you would save more lives on the highway than by all of the so-called safety equipment on cars. The seat belts, the airbags, they don't hold a candle in terms of the number of lives that would be saved to the cessation of alcohol. Now, needless to say, I am not in favor of prohibition. But I am not in favor of prohibition of alcohol. I am not in favor of prohibition of smoking. I am not in favor of the prohibition of cyclamates or saccharin. I am simply in favor of letting everybody know what the risks are and letting everybody do what he, in the fullest of his own wisdom and judgment, wishes to do. So I'm in a consistent position. But the people in the FDA, the people like Mr. Nader, are in an utterly inconsistent position. Now, truth to tell, most of them would be delighted to prohibit cigarette smoking if they thought they could get away with it. They profess to be pro-consumer, but they are only pro-consumer in words in respect to those areas where they think they got a chance of pulling the wool over the eyes of the people whom they supposedly are helping. Of course, the one conclusion I finally have come to after reading all about saccharin and cyclamates and smoking and booze is that the real thing that ought to be on every package that everybody buys, not only on cigarette packages, is the obvious truth that living is dangerous to your health. Well, let me ask and go to the more basic question we want to discuss. On what grounds am I so confident that these governmental measures, that the approach through government to try to reduce the hazards of the individual, to try to improve the consumer's life, on what grounds am I so confident that they are counterproductive? How can I be so sure? There are two grounds which are quite different but mutually supporting. The first is a ground of experience. You may think this is a new era, but it is not. There were Ralph Naders or their equivalents nearly 100 years ago. The earliest effective Ralph Naders in the United States were indeed the Ralph Naders who were out beating the hustings and trying to build up political pressure for controlling the railroad monopolies. Those were strictly pro-consumer movements. The argument at the time was that these monopolistic railroads, depicted in exactly the same way that Ralph Nader depicts big business in general, that these monopolistic railroads were entering into collusion with one another to fix fares and to keep fares too high, all in order to be able to squeeze a hapless consumer and take his money away from him. They were, and the earliest, as I say, example that I can think of the most of the consumer advocate of the Ralph Naders, and they were successful. They succeeded in getting the Interstate Commerce Commission established in 1887, and we can now, some 90 years later, look back and ask, from that experience, what happened? How did that episode work? We can do a little more that's kind of interesting. We can ask, who really got that law passed? Because there has been a great deal of work done on who really provided the political muscle for getting the Interstate Commerce Commission Act passed. And if you examine the ICC history, you get an absolutely typical picture of regulation and its effects that applies, so far as I know, to every other agency of a similar kind. In the first place, who got it through? It was not only these do-good reformers. It was not only the people who were opposed against the railroads. It really got through because the railroads got behind it. Now, why did the railroads get behind it? Well, the truth to tell, of course, the railroads, like all other private entrepreneurs, wanted to make money, and they had been trying over and over again to establish price-fixing agreements. But every time they got together an agreement, some chiseler, and there's always one chiseler in a crowd, some chiseler would cut fares. If I may bring it down to the modern day, there was always a Freddie Laker around. And so they couldn't hold their price-fixing agreements. They'd have an agreement, it would hold for a year, and it would go to pieces. When these reformers came along, these do-good reformers came along, and started to talk about how we ought to have the government control the railroad, some of these people were pretty smart, and they got together and said, you know, that's not a bad idea. And so they provided the political muscle for helping to get the law through. Now, it's a very typical case because, in my opinion, the typical fact is that the special interest, like the railroads, can almost never get their way unless they can somehow or other co-opt some disinterested, well-meaning people to serve as their front men and profess that the policies they are proposing are in the interest of the country. On the other hand, the well-meaning do-gooders are often, almost always, unable to get their measures across, although in recent years that's been less so, but certainly for a long time, unless they could get some more effective source of political muscle behind them. And so the typical thing you have had is an unholy coalition between the reformers on the one hand and the special interests on the other, who get together to establish a government agency or to pass a law from the point of view of the reformers to protect the consumers, from the point of view of the special interest to protect themselves. Now, the day after the law is passed, the do-gooders turn to the next crusade. They've succeeded, they've gotten this passed, they're on to the next thing. I don't really know enough about the detailed history of the 1880s to know exactly what it was at that time. 20 years later, it was clear. It was in reaction to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It was meat inspection. But what it was in 1890, I don't know. Whether they joined William Jennings Bryan bandwagon for free silver or what, I don't know. But at any rate, they turned their attention to other things. But the special interest, the railroads, that's different. This is their business. They spend 24 hours a day on acting on the agency after it's been enacted. And the result invariably is that they have a strong tendency to take it over. And they have a strong tendency to use it in their interest. And that clearly happened from the very day one with the Interstate Commerce Commission. A very simple example, which is absolutely decisive, has to do with the so-called long-haul, short-haul clause. One of the complaints of the reformers was that the railroads would charge less between 2 points, like, say, New York and Chicago, between which several railroads ran, than the sum of the fares between, let's say, New York and Philadelphia, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Chicago. Because the argument went, they had monopolies on those subsections, but they were subject to competition on the long haul, and it was unfair that they should charge higher fares to the people going the shorter segments. The sum of their fares should be equal to the long fare. Well, after the ICC was passed, the long-haul, short-haul differential was eliminated. But I give you only one guess as to how it was eliminated. You are right, the long-haul fare was raised to equal the sum of the short-haul fares. And that's how the reformers helped the consumer. The next step along the line, not the next step literally, but quite a long way down the line on the ICC, was the emergence of automobiles and trucking. Now, there never was any argument for regulating trucks. The arguments from the ICC experience didn't apply. At least there was a plausible case that railroads, there was only one railroad running between many areas, that railroads had some natural monopoly element. There was at least, you can make a plausible case, anti-monopoly case for controlling railroads. But trucks, anybody can buy a truck. You can have an indefinite number of truck companies. Any number of trucks can run in competition even between small places. Why were trucks brought under the Interstate Commerce Commission? Not to protect the consumer, to protect the railroads. The railroads were threatened with competition from the trucks, and in order to reduce that competition, they arranged to have trucking brought under the railroads. Now, subsequently, the trucks became so powerful that they started to take off over the ICC, and they started to use the ICC for their own benefit at the expense of the railroads. And the story has continued, although in the short run, and this short run was a long time, for 30, 40 years or so, the ICC was clearly a major benefit of the railroad industry. In the long run, it destroyed it. And we are now going in the final stages of government involvement with essentially the nationalization of the railroad industry through Amtrak and through Conrail. And I predict that that movement is almost irreversible, and that within 5 or 10 years we will have a nationalized railroad industry, which will provide you about the same level of consumer service as you get from your other well-known nationalized industries. I've gone into a little detail in ICC because it's the oldest and the simplest. But you will get the same story from almost any other agency you look at. I'll come back and briefly a little later to the CAB and the FDA. But I want first, before I do that, to say that's the kind of evidence you have from experience. Now, what does analysis tell you? Suppose you for a moment forget about experience and say, well, let's use our noggins here and ask, what would you expect? In the first place, for the reasons I've already cited, makes a great deal of sense that an unholy coalition of well-meaning reformers and of businessmen will ultimately leave the businessmen. I say businessmen, I don't mean businessmen, I mean whatever special interest. Whether it be farmers, in the case of the maritime business, it's mostly the maritime trade unions who are the special interest. In the case of the minimum wage law, which is also an anti-producer as well as anti-worker, that minimum wage law is anti-worker, anti-Negro, anti-consumer. It's all of these things, because it raises prices, it reduces employment opportunities, it promotes discrimination against the blacks. So it's all of these things. But in that case, it's the trade unions who are the major special interests. So in talking about business, I don't mean to single them out. It's only that in the early days of this development, and particularly in the Interstate Commerce Commission development, it was business. If you have an unholy coalition between reformers and a special interest, it stands to reason that the special interest is going to win out in the end, simply because the do-good reformers are going to go off to other activities and are not going to devote the energy to it. But in the second place, consider, that point I think is brought out very, very well by the ICC. But consider the other question. Consider the pressures on the bureaucrats. And you put yourself in the position of one of the bureaucrats in one of these regulatory agencies. And ask yourself, is it in your own self-interest to protect the consumer? Well, now, if I take you in the ICC, that case is crystal clear. First of all, the people whom you're going to be dealing with day after day in the ICC are the railroad interests. You very seldom have the passenger who goes once a year from New York to Chicago. He's not going to be pestering you. In the second place, if you ever want to make a career outside the ICC, where are you going to be hired? You're going to be hired by the transportation industry. As you know, the way to become a tax expert is first to get employed by the IRS for a couple of years and then go work for an enterprise. In the same way, the way to become a transportation expert is to work for the Interstate Commerce Commission for a while and then get a job with the industry. But I want to take a case that's not so easy. Consider the FDA, which I think brings out the case much better, the Food and Drug Administration. Originally arose out of the reaction to the Upton-Sinclair jungle kind of exposure, but more recently has been moving more and more in the direction of drugs as opposed to foods. Now, you put yourself in the position of an FDA bureaucrat considering whether to approve, let's take the simplest case, whether to approve a proposed new drug. There are two kinds of mistakes you can make from the point of view of the public interest. You can make the mistake of approving a drug that turns out to have very harmful side effects. That's one mistake. That will harm the public. Or you can make the mistake of not approving a drug which would have very beneficial effects. That's also harmful to the public. If you're such a bureaucrat, what's going to be the effect on you of those two mistakes? If you make a mistake and approve a product that has harmful side effects, you are a devil incarnate. Your misdeed will be spread on the front page of every newspaper. Your name will be mud. You will get the blame. If you fail to approve a drug which might save lives, the people who would object to that are mostly going to be dead. You're not going to hear from them. It's more extreme. It's more serious. Because suppose you fail to approve a drug which isn't so dramatic that it would actually save lives, but would just improve the comfort of everybody. Suppose in the 1890s there had been a present FDA and aspirin had been offered to it as a drug. It would never have been approved. Now, aspirin may not save very many lives, but it certainly has produced a tremendous improvement in human comfort over the decades. But that improvement, nobody would know it had been denied them. That's really the point with which I started when I came in here about the policy of rationing as opposed to a price mechanism. The people who are outside. The bureaucrat who turns down what ultimately would turn out to be a good drug, not many people are going to complain about that. Now, there will be some. The people who develop the drug will complain about it. But then you can dismiss those. They are special pleaders. They're just trying to pursue their own narrow, greedy self-interest at the expense of the innocent, gullible public. There will be some physicians, perhaps, who have been involved in it. A few patients who have tried it on an experimental basis. If you have the present situation of different standards in different countries, there will be some feedback from abroad. There will be people who have gone abroad and heard about this, so there will be some objections. But I think you will agree with me that as a bureaucrat, your self-interest lies in taking all kinds of chances of failing to approve a good drug in order to reduce the chance that you will approve a bad drug. And consequently, the net effect of the self-interest of the bureaucrat, and I'm not questioning motives. I'm not saying they're bad people. They're not. They're perfectly good people. Their intentions are fine. They're you and me. If any one of us were in that position, if any one of us took a job, I might go on and say that those of us who didn't take that attitude wouldn't hold those jobs very long. There's a selective process. Evolution works in every area. It doesn't only work in monkeys. It doesn't only work in social in physical characteristics. It also works in social institutions. And those bureaucrats who gave a proper balance to approval on the one hand and disapproval on the other would not have a long life in governmental bureaus. They would be pilloried, and they would be kicked out. And so those bureaucrats who survive will only be able to survive if they follow a policy that is very harmful to the consumer. The results are very predictable for the reasons I've given. The results are that you will have an excess of prevention of good drugs in order to avoid excess of prohibition of good drugs, in order to avoid admitting a few bad ones, that you will increase the costs of doing medical research, that you will reduce the amount of medical research done, that you will reduce the battery of drugs available to the public. And these effects have clearly been manifest. It has become much more expensive to meet FDA standards since the 1962 Kefauver amendments, which greatly strengthened the requirements imposed on the FDA, requiring them to judge not only the safety but also the efficacy of new drugs. There have been any number of studies, Sam Peltzman's path-breaking and brilliant study of the costs versus the benefits of regulation, in which he establishes a tremendous excess of the costs of the FDA regulation over the benefit. The work of some of the people at the Rochester Center, Dr. Wardwell, Dr. Lasagna, who have compared and listed the drugs that are available abroad and those that are available here. The number of new drugs that are admitted each year, which has been cut in half in the United States. The increasing tendency for companies in the United States to do their research abroad in order to get away from the requirements at home. And you can go on and on. The effects have been disastrous, in my opinion, in this respect. Now, the question one wants to ask is, who benefits from such regulation? We've seen that if you have things like ICC, FDA, CAB, SEC, FPA, etc., we've seen that the consumer is hurt. Who benefits? The obvious beneficiaries are, of course, first, the do-good reformers who get these measures across. They benefit, the Ralph Naders and his group benefit because they get publicity, they get, and if, no, let me not put it that way. Let's assume they're perfectly sincere. They get the achievement of their objectives. They get what they're looking for. The bureaucrats who get hired benefit. Again, one of the most rapidly expanding areas of employment is employment within these regulatory agencies. I have to confess that in part I'm talking against my professional interests. The thing that has kept the market for economists high ever since the New Deal days, that has meant that in the recent years when the demand for most other professions have gone down, the demand for economists has stayed high. The thing that has kept the demand for economists high has been increasing government regulation. Indeed, lawyers and economists are about the only two groups in the community who are in a very good position to make sure that the demand keeps up with the supply. So the group of people who are hired and take jobs in these areas benefit. What about industry? Does it benefit or is it hurt? And the answer here is not easy to give. In general, with respect to industry or business, there are conflicting effects. Some in the direction of favoring the industry or the business, some in the effect of hurting the industry or the business. For example, take the case of the drug industry and take the case of FDA, and what about the pharmaceutical companies? Well, on the one hand, they are hurt by the fact that it becomes more expensive and more difficult to conduct research into new products, more costly to introduce them, takes a longer period of time. The drug lag, as you probably all know, has more than doubled since the 1962 Kefauver amendments. That is a lag between proposing a drug for approval and the final approval of that small fraction which are finally approved. In the case of those that are disapproved, the lag has become infinite. In those respects, the pharmaceutical companies are harmed. On the other hand, they are also benefited because they, like the railroads, are to some extent protected from competition. If it takes company A long time and is very expensive to introduce a new product, it also takes company B a long time, and it's very expensive for company B. So that company B benefits, company B at that stage loses and company A benefits. A case that happens to interest me personally because it happens to be tied in with some problems that my wife has had in one of her eyes is the soft lens case. The contact lens that Bausch & Lomb introduced as a soft lens. Now, it took Bausch & Lomb a long time to get approval for that from FDA, and they spent I don't know how many tens of millions of dollars in order to get approval. I may say it's unclear that it should ever have been under the authority of FDA. FDA had never exercised authority over eyeglasses, but they decided to exercise authority over the soft contact lenses. They had never exercised authority before that over the hard contact lenses. But of course, you realize that's another common characteristic of the bureaucrat. You want to extend your control as much as you can. That's the way to get influence. That's the way to get a larger staff. That's the way to be more important. So, of course, every bureaucrat in his own self-interest will tend to find that his power covers any questionable area. But let me go back. Bausch & Lomb spent a lot of money in getting the soft lens approved. But once it was approved, they had a free play, they had a free field for something like 3 or 4 years. Only just now are other soft lenses coming and being approved. And you can understand why that is. If FDA made Bausch & Lomb take 3 or 4 years to get approval, it's only fair that they should impose the same costs on everybody else. Equality above everything. The result of that is that Bausch & Lomb is sort of a standoff. And in general, when Professor Sam Peltzman, who made the study I was talking about earlier about the effect of the Kefauver amendments in the drug area, went to investigate the effect on the profits of pharmaceutical companies, he came out with the conclusion that it was roughly a standoff, that on the average they had neither benefited nor lost from it. Well, that may be true or may not be. I'm sure some companies benefited and some lost, and much depended on the character of the company. In the short run, it may be a trade-off, but in the long run, over a longer period of time, I have no doubt that the industry loses because it ceases to be a private industry sooner or later. If you take the railroads, again, the history over 100 years of the railroads is an excellent example of what is the natural course of governmental regulation and governmental policy. It inevitably goes from regulation to subsidization to ultimate takeover. And if that took 100 years, or 90 years really, for railroads, you know, there's technological improvement in all respects. Now let me turn to the positive side. How can the consumer be protected? How is he protected? The clear answer, the answer that in my opinion cannot be denied, is that the most effective protection of the consumer is free competition. Free competition at home and free trade throughout the world. It's the free market, free private market, with free competition everywhere that is his best protector. The great danger to the consumer is from monopoly, whether it be private or public. The great protection of the consumer is having alternative sources of supply. The thing that keeps the consumer from being exploited by Mr. X is that if Mr. X tries to charge him too much, he can turn to Mr. Y. Governmental regulatory agencies hurt the consumer because they promote monopoly, because they prevent new entry, because they keep down the number of potential competitors. And they do so both at home and in respect to what happens from abroad. Because once government regulates an industry, it no longer can really stand idly by if that industry tends to be affected by imports from abroad, because now it's got an obligation, having imposed costs on the industry, it has to, as it would say, protect it. Within a country, competitive forces make enterprises serve the consumer. That's the only way they can get money. That's the only way they can make money. The only way any enterprise can get money is by selling a consumer something he's willing to pay for. People often say to me, why do you make such a big difference between private enterprise and government enterprise? What difference does it make? Whether you have a great big General Motors Corporation, it's a bureaucracy of the most extraordinary size, or whether you have a great big government corporation producing automobiles. Well, it makes a big difference. And the difference is that there is no way in which General Motors can get $1 from you unless you agree to hand it over. General Motors cannot send a policeman to pick your pocket, but the U.S. government can. And as a result, General Motors must serve your interests in a way which the U.S. government as a whole or a government agency does not have to. It's the possibility of other competition. It's because if General Motors doesn't serve your interest, you can buy a Ford product or a Chrysler product, or you can buy a Volkswagen, or you can buy a Toyota. That's what prevents General Motors from exploiting you. Look at the record. Suppose you compare what has happened over the past 50 years in the development of transportation by automobile and transportation by rail. Is there any comparison between the extent to which the consumer interests have been served in the one case and disserved in the other? Why? Because the automobile industry was competitive, had to compete at home and abroad. The railroad industry was subject to government regulation. Or compare what has happened to the technical perfection of the delivery of sound via hi-fi and of written messages via the post office. No government agency has been behind the enormous technological improvements in the hi-fi area. Government legal monopoly has prevented equally great improvements in the transmission of messages by mail or similar means. Or if you want a still more personal letter, if any of you, and I know there's at least one in this room who is, but if any of you speak native French, French is your native language, try talking French with a graduate of a Berlitz school and a graduate of a public high school, and see how they compare. Again, why? Or in the international trade area. I've already mentioned the great case of Fred Laker. One of the worst areas of regulation in the United States has been the Civil Aeronautics Board. It's very hard to believe, but it's true, that since the Civil Aeronautics Board assumed control over the airlines in the 1930s, not a single new trunk line has been approved for operation in the United States. The number of major trunk lines in the United States is now less. There are fewer of them than there were in 1938 or 39. Fares have been kept unduly high. There's strong evidence that had you had free competition in the airline industry's fares would have been roughly half what they are now. We get that evidence from cases which are very interesting. The case of the PSA airline, the Pacific Southwest airline in California, which because it was an intrastate airline, with California being big enough to support an airline, did not have to get CAB approval for its fares and schedules. Now that's a very, very interesting case in two respects. Its fares were about 60% of comparable CAB-approved fares, and yet it made money and did very well. From that point of view, it's a great advertisement for freedom of competition. But the next step is really equally interesting. No sooner did PSA get established than it lobbied the California state legislature to impose the equivalent of CAB within California to prevent other people from doing the same thing. So as I say, it illustrates both parts of the story and explains why it is that you and I as consumers have to look after our own interests and not trust to surrogates, whether they supposedly speak in our interest or not. But consider what has happened in this area. Here, one maverick, Fred Laker, finally, after years of trying, by continually offering to cut fares tremendously between Britain and the United States on a SkyTrain, has forced all the other airlines to come and offer lower fares, which the CAB apparently is more or less forced to approve. Hard to have a more dramatic example, it seems to me, of the virtues of competition and how the consumer is protected. Now let me emphasize, competition does not protect the consumer because businessmen are more soft-hearted than bureaucrats, or because they're more altruistic, or because they're more generous. but only because it is in the self-interest of the entrepreneur to protect the consumer. And on this subject, let me quote you from what the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, wrote 200 years ago in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And here's what he said, and I quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens." So it's not from benevolence, but from self-interest. To return to the FDA, suppose it weren't there, what would prevent business from distributing adulterated products? It would be a very expensive thing to do. Consider the story that many of you heard of a New Jersey firm which had been producing and marketing a high-quality soup product for 50 years very profitably. After 50 years of apparently safe operation, one case of adulterated or contaminated soup cans got out. That company very shortly went bankrupt. That's not a very sensible business practice. But what about the claim that the consumer cannot judge the quality of complex products, that he therefore requires the government support and the help, and this government help? There are two answers to that, and the market provides a very excellent answer. One answer is that when it comes to complicated product, the consumer doesn't really trust his own judgment. He trusts the judgment of middlemen. Let me illustrate. Nobody in this room is an expert about the quality of shirts, ties, shoes, goodness knows what. If one of them goes bad, if you find it's defective, do you go back to the shirt manufacturer? No. You go to the department store from which you bought it. And the department store is acting as your middleman, and indeed the reason the department store can exist and make money is because it can get the consumer to have confidence that the department store will sell it a good product for the price. In the same way, you will rely on a Sears Roebuck or a Montgomery Ward or a General Electric or a General Motors, not because they are altruistic, but because it is in their self-interest to build up their capital, to get the reputation and the standing which would be destroyed if they consistently turned out bad products. Moreover, there's no perfection in this world. We're never going to be protected against all defects. What about the claim that if the consumer cannot judge the quality of the complex products, therefore the bureaucrat can? What about the evidence that has appeared that all of the studies about cyclamates, I say all of a very shoddy list of studies that the FDA relied on, they have been disproved. I understand they have been disproved by further research. Now there's one important difference there. If a business firm does something wrong, as in that case of the soup firm, it goes bankrupt and out of business. But if the FDA or a government agency makes a mistake, that expands the staff of that government agency. What about the claim that consumers can be led by the nose by false advertising? The claim that people like John Kenneth Galbraith have done the most to propose. Well, the simplest answer is that he can't be. And if you don't believe it, ask the man ask Mr. Ford what happened to the Edsel. Promoted by an enormously expensive advertising campaign, one of the great duds of all times. The fact is that the consumer is going ultimately to decide on the quality of the product he buys and not on the claims. And on the contrary, he's going to be put off by the claims. Is in any event, again, we must always compare alternatives. It's no good to point out a problem. You can't beat a candidate without a candidate. You must not compare the real world with an ideal alternative. You have to compare real with real. And we have to ask, If business advertising is misleading, is a monopoly of government advertising an answer? I submit to you that I know no advertising widely dispersed that is more misleading than government advertising. If you read what the government agencies say about their products, for example, the advertising used by the Treasury to sell its savings bonds, any bank that advertised its product that way would be hauled before the FTC before you could say Jack Robinson. Or the advertising which Social Security uses to sell its shoddy product. So government monopoly is hardly a solution. Finally, and most important, does it pay enterprises to engage in false advertising? It's like the question of whether it pays them to produce shoddy products. Of course, occasionally, a fly-by-night outfit can make some money by fooling people. But you know, Abraham Lincoln was absolutely right when he said many, many years ago, you can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all of the people some of the time. But you can't fool all of the people all of the time. The profits of most enterprises depend on continuing custom. They don't depend on a one-time sale. And it is therefore in the long run self-interest of the company, in its own self-interest, to be sure that its advertising corresponds to the product it is selling. As I say, of course, there will always be some shoddy products. There will always be some quacks. There will always be some con artists. We got to wait till the next world before we get rid of them. But we have to look at the real world and ask how the consumer can be best protected in this world. Here, to go back to where I began, the so-called consumer advocates may be sincere. They may be firmly persuaded of the rightness of their case. Or they may be ambitious men seeking acclaim, influence, and political office. It doesn't matter. Whichever be the case, as consumers, we will do best to regard them as confidence men who are out to take us to the cleaners, rather than as our friends who are going to protect us from the big bad wolf of industry. Thank you.
My name is Andy Signori. I'm with Corporate Engineering, and I wonder if the progression of events that we've seen in Great Britain is a progression that we'll necessarily see in the United States, and what your opinion is on that.
We will not necessarily see it, but we are highly likely to see it, unless we change course. The progression of events in Great Britain is exactly the progression of events in the United States, except at an earlier date. That is, Britain has been a leader in this respect. And we have been following with an interval of about 15 to 20 years. Now, of course, in some ways, some places we've speeded ahead. For example, in respect to the matters I've been talking about today, in the control of drugs, we have gone much farther in detailed regulation of drugs than Britain has. But in other respects, we're much farther behind them. Thank God for small favors. But if we continue down the path we have been going on for these past 40 years, we shall end up where Britain seems to be headed. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Jean-Paul Valens. As you can tell, I learned English in a state-sponsored university. My question is regarding the so-called energy problem. There are a lot of solutions that have been proposed. None of them are very simple, like I suspect you would propose, mainly to let the free market determine the price of various type of energy. And what do you think of the latest Carter proposal with this respect?
Well, as you know, that's another case of a set of measures which in part are supposed to protect the consumer. Because in the whole energy area, I didn't go into it because it's just duplicates what we've seen elsewhere. The real problems in energy in the United States date back to 1954, 23 years ago, at which time, because of a Supreme Court decision in the so-called Phillips case, the Federal Power Commission was more or less instructed by the courts to set a maximum price at which natural gas could be sold. Now, for a while, for quite a long while, that imposed no great problem. A maximum price doesn't have any effect unless the price is less than it otherwise would be. And for quite a long time, you were in a period where energy prices were going down. You did not have substantial inflation, so that maximum price was largely ineffective. But after a while, that maximum price began to bite. And when the maximum price began to bite, what did it do? It made it less economical to produce gas. It made it more economical to use gas. It stimulated consumption, and it retarded production. Now, even so, that might not have been itself a disastrous thing, except that when Mr. Nixon, in the most, in my opinion, harmful thing he did in the whole of his administration, far more harmful than the much more publicized Watergate scandals, when he imposed price and wage controls in August 15, 1971, when he simultaneously put controls on domestic prices and took off controls from foreign exchange, when his left hand did not know what his right hand was doing, that spread the damage from gas to oil. Because now you set a ceiling on the price of oil, of crude oil. And that ceiling on the price of crude oil started to have the same effect as the ceiling on the price of natural gas, to encourage consumption and discourage production. And that is the ultimate source of the whole energy problem. Has nothing to do with the world running out of oil. It provided the OPEC cartel with their opportunity. They might still have tried to get away with it in the absence of it, but they wouldn't have been as able to get away with it. And almost everything that has come from that has emerged from those initial acts of regulating the price. Now, all of this, as I say, when you hear the people in Washington who talk about this, as I heard Senator Henry Jackson on TV just yesterday talking about this, and talking about whether the price of natural gas was going to be deregulated. Oh, no, it'll cost, he said, the American people $10 billion to deregulate gas. No, that is utter nonsense. It has cost the American people a tremendous sum to have regulated it. Will you tell me how any person is benefited by not being able to buy natural gas and being forced to use coal instead? Or having to use much more expensive oil than coal? Will you tell me how anybody is benefited by natural gas not being available for industry and therefore he doesn't have a job? But no, Henry Jackson is a friend of the consumer, and he is going to see to it that the homeowner isn't hurt. And the tendency, therefore, in the energy program, for exactly that kind of reason, is that if you look at all of the measures that are proposed in that energy program, they are measures that are designed to make the costs imposed on the consumer by the program invisible. Price control is going to be kept. Gas is going to be restricted to household use and visible use. But the utilities are going to be required at almost whatever cost to convert to coal. Factories are going to be prevented from using coal. If not, oil. They're going to be required to use coal. If not, they're going to be required to pay a very high tax. The effect of that will be to make energy more expensive than it otherwise need be, to lead to a wasteful use of energy, to make the cost come out to the consumer in the form of the prices of the products he buys, rather than in the direct price that he pays at the gas pump. But it'll also come out at the gas pump. And part of the effect, of course, is to strengthen the power of OPEC to control the price of oil. The effect of these measures, since the Federal Energy Administration was established in order to protect the Americans' oil supply from the foreign OPEC effect, since it was established with the objective of increasing domestic availability of oil and gas, what has happened? Our imports of oil from abroad have been going up very rapidly as a percentage of total energy consumption. Why? Because the effect of the oil, and a complicated thing that I can't go into here through an so-called entitlements program, the effect of our present oil price program is to give a subsidy of $3 a barrel to every barrel of oil imported from abroad. And again, who's paying for it? The consumer is paying for it one way or another. He may not pay for it directly. He may pay for it indirectly in taxes. In my opinion, if you had not had these perverse governmental measures over the last 10 years, well, really since 1971 primarily, the OPEC cartel would be gone by now. It would have collapsed as other cartels have collapsed. But we've shored it up. And the Carter Energy Program, I think, will be an utter disaster. You know, it's absolutely hilarious if it weren't so serious. In order to protect the American consumer against the cost of energy, we establish a Department of Energy whose annual budget is greater than the total cost of all the oil we are importing from Saudi Arabia. That's how you, the consumer, are protected against being exploited by those big bad oil companies. So I think the energy program is a disaster. We have a gentleman here who...
Dr. Friedman, I'm Terry Sanders. Since we don't seem to have learned a great deal in the last 90 years, what do you think the prospect is for doing better? In other words, how do we go about getting a freer enterprise system, particularly in view of our pretty bad record in recent decades?
That's a very good question, and I wish I had an easy answer to you, but I don't. I don't see any other way than to do as we always try to do, to persuade one another, to try to operate through public opinion, to try to operate through influencing our representatives in Washington. After all, again, as I was saying before, it's not from, as Adam Smith said, it's not from benevolence that we get our daily bread. And it's not from malevolence that we get the bad laws. If the representatives in Washington vote these bad laws, it's because it's in their own self-interest to vote them. And it's in their own self-interest to vote them because it has been proved to be a way in which they can get elected. Ultimately, the Congress is going to do what we, the people, ask them to do. And it's ultimately because we, the people, have been misled on these matters. Because we have thought that the way to solve problems was to turn to Washington, that Washington has been ever ready to try to undertake an answer to those problems. So I don't see any long-run answer other than public understanding and public recognition of the problem. In this area, I see some good signs. I think the public is becoming increasingly disillusioned with government. I think that there is a widespread feeling around the country that maybe throwing money at a problem isn't always a way to solve it. And I may say, if I may, speaking here in this great city of New York, that I think few things have done more to promote a healthy understanding of the problems of over-government than what has happened in New York City. We all thank you.
Professor Friedman, I'm Joe Capo, and possibly you have already answered part of the question that I was going to put to you. Do you have any particular advice for the individual consumer's action on the basis of these TV programs that you're embarking on?
Well, the question is, what advice is there for the individual consumer? And the best advice is to beware of confidence men of all kind in whatever guise they come. Whether they come to you as St. Ralph or as Mr. Clean. Beyond that, in your question, I think there is very little that there is to be said about the consumer. You know, most of us are pretty good at protecting our own interests. I think that there's a strong tendency to denigrate how sensible people are in protecting their self-interest in the narrow sense as consumers. And indeed, you know, while much of the rhetoric is pro-consumer, the substance is often anti-consumer in the sense that what the so-called consumer advocates are really after is to make the consumer behave as the advocate believes he ought to behave, rather than as the consumer himself really desires. It's in that sense that they want to protect the consumer. It's in the sense of saying, I know better than you what's good for you. And in your own self-interest, you're going to have to do it. So I think that as consumers, we're pretty good if you leave us alone. But I think in our role as citizens, we're terrible. And for the same reason. If you're going to buy something every day, it pays you to look into whether that's good or bad. If you're going to deal with a grocer, you better look daily. You better be pretty sure that he's a reasonably reliable grocer and that you'll get what you order and that he won't short-weight you or short-change you. But if you're going to have to vote once a year on what? On a long, long list of propositions, very little relationship between your vote and what ultimately comes out, how much time does it pay you to inform yourself about that? It's just a waste of time and energy. You're not going to influence anything. So it's understandable, in my opinion, why the individual is far better as a consumer in his private capacity than he is as a citizen in his public capacity. And what we have to do from that point of view is to drive home that lesson and make individuals recognize the enormous importance of setting a limit to the powers that we grant to the government. We cannot do it on a case-by-case basis unless we can do it on an overall basis. And there are various ways of doing this, through tax limitation amendments, through other things. I think we won't succeed.
Hi, I'm Steve Love from Pharmaceuticals. I'd like to know how you feel about the Laetrile question. It seems to me that that's possibly a classic example of the consumer not really being in a position to make the proper choices and seemingly making the improper choice.
That's a very good question, and I'm delighted you asked that because it's the first question that has really been related to the talk. And we're getting, so you get a special gold medal. And we're getting close to the end of the time when we ought to be shutting this off, but we'll get to you. First of all, I believe that the FDA or any other government agency ought to publish and make available any information it has on Laetrile. My feeling on Laetrile is exactly the same as my feeling on everything else. I think that the consumer ought to be free to make his own judgment. I have no idea whether Laetrile is a useless substance derived from apricot pits or whether it's the greatest boon to mankind. I have no idea, no judgment on it. But I believe that if I were in the situation of a terminal cancer patient or a not-so-terminal cancer patient, that I ought to have freedom to choose whether I wanted to be on Laetrile or not. Now, Laetrile is a very, very interesting case because, so far as I know, neither the FDA nor anybody else has said that Laetrile does any harm. The argument against Laetrile is that the harm which it does is to prevent the patient from seeking more effective cures. But there are no more effective cures. If there were really a truly effective cure, I don't think there'd be much of a problem. Now, there may be better or worse cures. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm not saying that it isn't better for some people to do something other than Laetrile. I'm not making that judgment. I'm saying that I don't believe that some people sitting in Washington ought to be able to make that judgment for me. That's my business. I belong to me, not to them. It's my life at stake. And if I choose to risk my life, if I choose to walk across the street out here, should I be free to do it? I'm risking my life. If I choose to take Laetrile rather than something else, that's my business. Now, of course I'm not well informed. Who is? If the information were really clear and unambiguous, publishing it would be enough, and even that wouldn't do the trick. The information on tobacco, on the effect of cigarette smoking on lung cancer and on other diseases, is, in my opinion, decisive. In fact, it was strong enough 20 years ago to lead me to give up smoking. And so far as I know, the evidence since then has only become stronger. The people who smoke know that. And if they choose deliberately to take the chance of killing themselves through smoking, because the satisfaction that they get from the smoking is worth it, that's their business. I don't see that it's any business of mine to stop them. And similarly, so far as Laetrile is concerned, I believe that you ought to have the completely free sale, not only of Laetrile, But you see, I'm much more extreme and much more radical. I am in favor of the free and open sale of all drugs, whatever they may be, including heroin, including the addictive drugs. Not because I think they're good for you. Far from it. Not because I think that they don't do tremendous harm to people who take them. But on the one ground, because I believe we have no right to stop people from doing it, and on the other, because if you look at the evidence, the costs of prohibiting them are greater than the costs of permitting them. Most of the harm which is done by hard drugs is done because they are illegal. It's done because the illegality, the fact that they are illegal, causes them to be extremely expensive. It provides monopoly. You know, it's a very interesting example of the same thing we've been talking about regulation. The effect of making heroin and other drugs illegal is to provide a monopoly position for those people who are able to supply them. You can't just have free competition in that area. As a result, this leads to the fact that the man who is in a position to sell heroin has an economic incentive to produce addicts, to invest capital in producing an addict because he'll have a tied customer, a customer who is tied to him. But it means also that the customer is driven to steal. He is driven to illegal activity in order to support his habit. And I believe that the evidence is overwhelming. If you want to see that evidence, just look at the experience of alcoholic prohibition, which is identically the same thing. After all, alcohol is an addictive drug. There's no difference in principle between alcohol and any of these others. And if you look at our experience through prohibition and trying to stop alcohol, you can see that rendering it illegal did far more harm than the harm which was done by its legality. So I don't have any difficulty on the Laetrile question.
Professor Friedman, my name is Linda Strube, and I'd like to ask you your opinion on the subject of product safety and the insurance that's required because of it. What has been the effect on the small business and people's ability to get into and succeed as a small business?
That's a very good question, and a very pertinent one, because there's no doubt that one of the side effects of all manners of governmental regulation, and not merely the one you're talking about, has been adverse in general to the small business. Not entirely. There's one advantage the small business has as a result of regulation. It's much easier for the small business to engage in illegal activities than it is for the big one. But outside of that dubious advantage, most of these measures discriminate against the small businessman. It's much more first of all, the expense of conforming to these various regulations. Whether you talk about OSHA, that is the Office of Safety and Health Administration, whether you talk about withholding taxes, wherever you go, there are certain costs involved that are more or less independent of the size of the business, and they're more easily borne by a big business than a small business. A big business can more easily defend itself legally and so on. So all of these measures do have a very adverse effect on small business. Now, in respect to the particular item of so-called safety standards and insurance against it, we have had a very dramatic shift over the past 10 or so years, almost from a doctrine of caveat emptor, buyer beware, under which it was assumed that the seller was liable only in case of proven negligence, to a situation which is almost vendor emptor, seller beware, in which the seller is assumed guilty unless proved innocent. And it's extremely difficult to prove him innocent. Now, the effect of that is going to be, as you were quite properly saying, to require a very much more costly process of producing products which have any chance of leading to damage suits. Now, from this point of view, the safety products requirements of one of those four-letter combinations I gave at the beginning of the talk was a safety agency. I've forgotten which combination of letters it is. But from that point of view, one of the effects of their putting out standards may be, in a way, to help the small business. Because if a small business can show that it conformed to the government standards, it may have no liability for damage which is done. So the effects on business, as always, are generally very mixed. The main person who will have to bear an extra cost, in this as the other case, is the consumers. The consumers will have to pay for this. Now, there's no reason why they shouldn't if they want to. But you see, each of us could do it voluntarily on that kind of thing. We could each buy insurance for ourselves against a variety of defects. Again, should we be compelled to buy it whether we want to or not? That's the fundamental issue. The argument for all of these measures, whether it be FDA, whether it be the safety products, that has the most merit, and which is the hardest to meet, is the argument from involuntary exposure. Now there is a real problem, a real issue. With respect to items like Laetrile, saccharin, heroin, it seems to me the case is crystal clear. I can choose. But now if a factory is emitting a noxious substance in the air, and I'm walking in the neighborhood or driving a car in the neighborhood, I am involuntarily exposed to a cost. And there I cannot choose. And there I really do have a dilemma, because there is no good way to handle that. It's not a good way to handle it through simply doing nothing about it. It's not a good way to handle it. Well, in many cases, if the damage is capable of being severe, it is properly handled by our present laws of responsibility, or our former ones, because then the person who is injured can bring suit and recover, and that makes it, that internalizes the cost in the economist's jargon, that is, it makes it in the self-interest of the company to avoid such things. But if the effect is a small, widely dispersed one, like the effects of emissions from car exhaust, it is very difficult to identify who's done the harm to you, and therefore to collect from it. And there is no good answer to that question. That's the only case in which I would recognize that one could establish a case at times for governmental intervention. But even there, I would say, almost always, you will find that the right kind of intervention is not to set standards, but to impose costs. Not to set requirements on the kind of emission control a car has to have, but to impose a tax proportional to the amount of emissions that come out. And similarly in the case that you're describing. I think we'll have to make this the very last question. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Friedman, in view of your philosophy, where do you stand on patents, trademarks, and copyrights?
Well, on the whole, those are, again, you know, there are easy questions and hard questions, and those are hard questions. They're like the case of the involuntary exposure. There's an argument for patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Trademarks are really in a little different position than patents and copyrights. And let me stick to patents and copyrights for a moment. There's an argument for patents and copyrights. After all, if I produce a new product, in order for me to have an incentive to do it, I have to be able to capture some of the gains. If once I've produced it, anybody can imitate it, how do I capture the gains? So in a way, you can interpret patents as part of what is an essential function of a society, which is to define property rights. And the same thing goes with copyrights. On the other hand, there is also an argument against them. In the case of patents, some of the most important inventions and developments are not capable of being patented. One of the great inventions of the last few decades has been the supermarket. It has done an enormous amount to reduce the cost of distributing goods. Nobody could patent it. So the effect of their existing patent law tends to introduce a bias for inventive talent to be directed against in the direction of those items that can be patented, as opposed to those items that are not susceptible of being patented. In addition, it is possible to use patents to interfere with competition, patents that are really not valid, not justified patents, but they can be a source of restricting competition, keeping other people out by all of the devices that have developed over the years, which you're much more competent than I am. In the same way with copyrights. There's an argument for a copyright on the ground that what a man writes is his property and he ought to be able to have the right to control it. There's an argument against it on the ground that you ought, after all, to make things available to people only on the basis of the extra cost of producing it. Now, interestingly enough, we have a good deal of experience of the absence of copyrights. There was a period of some 20 or 30 years in the 19th century when the U.S. did not join the International Copyright Convention, and essentially we operated without any copyrights. And it turned out to work very well, as a matter of fact. It turned out that the really successful authors really did even better, because there was such an enormous premium on your being the first one to publish them. Because unless you got them out fast, the other people would copy you. So I don't know. On that issue, I really have very mixed feelings. I think there's a case against them. There's some case for them. I think it would take a much more expert knowledge than I have of the details of them to be able to come out with a flat answer with respect to them. I think, as I say, that I'm afraid we will have to call this off. Thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to meet with you today.